What's up, everybody? In this video, I want to discuss a error/flaw that I believe the UFC has been making recently when it comes to building stars, upcoming prospects that the UFC is really wanting to push, and it starts and stops with what we witnessed last night between Jack Hermansson and Joe Bodybags Pyfer. Now, first of all, guys, I want to give Jack Hermansson his flowers, right? This man showed up. He did exactly what I said was probably going to happen in the breakdown. I did think Joe Pyfer was going to be able to get him out of there inside 2 rounds. I feel like we all kind of felt that in the early rounds, Joe Pyfer, with his power and his hand speed, he was going to have those advantages. But as the fight played out, we kind of figured if it gets into those later rounds that veteran presence of Jack Hermansson was going to take over, which is exactly what we witnessed. But guys, I want to take a look at the bigger picture when it comes to the UFC and some mistakes I feel like that they are making, and a mistake that maybe they made here with Joe Pyfer. Now, obviously, it's on Joe Pyfer to go out there and get the job done, right? I mean, so yes, in that aspect, he did come up short. But at the end of the day, guys, like, that was a big step up in competition for Joe Pyfer, right? He's fighting guys that are, he has a speed advantage over. He's a little more youthful than they are. He's kind of hitting that stride where he's in the prime of his career. He's getting favorable matchups where the UFC clearly wants him to win to build him, right? Now you give him a ranked guy in Jack Hermansson, who's ranked number 11. You get Pyfer that ranking. It's all great as long as he can win. But then we saw what happened last night. And I can't help but think, what happens if that fight was added, for example, just hypothetical, on UFC 298, say Joe Bodybags Pyfer versus Jack Hermansson was the featured prelim or opened up the main card. If that fight that we just saw was a 3-round fight opening up a pay-per-view, what happens? Most likely, Joe Pyfer beats Jack Hermansson and has a ranking next to his name. Now, I'm not here making excuses for Pyfer or anything like that. That's not what I'm doing. My point is, what we saw the UFC do with a guy like Sean O'Malley, for example, what we saw them do with Ilia Topuria, for example, are 2 guys that I'm going to bring up in this video because they're 2 of the big stars that are starting to kind of climb that the UFC is clearly putting some stock into, right? Because when we look at Sean O'Malley, he's a guy that's been in the UFC for a really, really long time at this point, guys. I mean, he was on the Contender Series. He wowed Dana, and Dana's like, this guy's got the it factor. That's who I'm looking for, a guy like Sean O'Malley. So what do? They give Sean O'Malley a lot of 3-round fights. They give him guys that are a little bit older. They give him guys that are a little slower to where they don't have very good striking, but they're not really a takedown threat. So they're very favorable matchups for Sean O'Malley. Now, we did see that a little bit with Joe Pyfer. But as we kind of get going a little bit, we see Sean O'Malley, he takes on Ilia Paiva. Then he gets a Pedro Munoz fight, which is that first kind of like little jump up in competition. But again, what was that fight? It was a 3-round fight. Then he goes on and takes on Petr Yan. And again, what was that fight? It was a 3-round fight. Now, granted, that is a huge jump up in competition for Sean O'Malley from going virtually unranked to maybe being 15 or 14 at the time. I don't exactly remember, to now climbing all the way up to fighting the number 1 guy at the time in Petr Yan, who arguably people thought should have still been the champ, who has some of the best striking in the division. You're going to make Sean O'Malley go to Abu Dhabi, take on Petr Yan, but it was a 3-round fight, guys. Why is that so important? Because I feel like the narrative every single time when we see these young, hungry lions that come into the sport, it's always the narrative. Like another example that I'm thinking of right now, Mike Malott, Neil Magny. Now, granted, that was a 3-round fight, though, so shame on kind of Mike Malott there. But you see what I'm saying? It's always that first and second round, oh man, you got to be careful because Pyfer's got the power, O'Malley's got the speed. That's like the narrative that we have, right? Those early rounds are going to favor that guy who's got all the hype behind him. But then as the fight plays out, there's always that like narrative, but if Jack Hermansson can drag this into the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and what did he do last night? That exact recipe. So my question is for the UFC, I feel like the UFC, when they sit back after what happened last night, they're going to be kicking themselves a little bit saying, man, we should have had Joe Pyfer fight in a 3-round fight because he would have beaten Jack Hermansson in a 3-round fight. Now, that's a little bit of hearsay, because at the end of the day, Jack Hermansson could have came out maybe a little bit more aggressive, knowing that he didn't have 5 rounds to work with. So that's a valid point. But can we all agree that a 3-round fight would have probably have favored Joe Bodybags Pyfer a little bit more? Because we saw that with Sean O'Malley and Petr Yan. Another example that we saw, which I think the UFC should have played the Pyfer situation out very much like how they played out the Ilia Topuria situation, which was Ilia Topuria comes in, he's virtually undefeated. Now, Pyfer was not undefeated at the time, so it's a little bit different there, but Topuria's got all this hype. He's got a large following on social media already. He's finishing fights. He's got the boxing. He's got the aura to him where they're like, this guy's going to be a contender, man. So what did they do? They throw him on a pay-per-view in a 3-round fight versus a ranked guy in Bryce Mitchell. So what happens? It's a 3-round fight, favorable for Ilia Topuria. It's not a 5-round fight where he can get kind of drug into the later rounds, has to worry about the cardio, the gas tank, because it's a 25-minute fight. Let's condense it down to 15. He beats a guy with a ranking next to him, which Ilia Topuria goes out, does his job, gets through Bryce Mitchell, and now he's got a ranking next to his name. So then what's the next step? Well, then we give him a 5-round fight night main event like they did against a guy like Josh Emmett, who is a really good matchup for Ilia Topuria because Ilia Topuria is outstanding wrestling. Josh Emmett's a good wrestler, so he's probably not going to out-wrestle Ilia Topuria. Okay, check. Then we move on, and it's like, well, who has the advantage in the striking? And it's like, I feel like we can all say Ilia Topuria, right? Not because we saw the fight play out, but coming into that, it's like Josh Emmett outside of a right hand is pretty one-dimensional. So I feel like our chances are really good here with Ilia Topuria getting through Emmett. And then if he does that, boom, voila, he has a 5-round fight coming into a title shot like we are witnessing right now ahead of his bout at UFC 298 at Alexander Volkanovski. Can you not sit here and tell me that if the UFC would have given Joe Pyfer Jack Hermansson in a 3-round fight, I think Joe Pyfer wins, and now he's in a situation where his next fight, he would be ranked, 11 or 12 because Hermansson was 11, so say he, just for this sake, he takes that number 11 ranking, then he fights Roman Dolidze next, who's coming off a loss, who's a guy who's like 8 or 9 or 10, right? So it's a small step up in competition. And now that's Joe Pyfer's first 5-round UFC Fight Night main event. His first ranked opponent his second fight against a ranked guy is now that 5-round fight. Instead of taking guys who are not fighting in these 5-round fights, giving them UFC Fight Night headliners to where I understand the UFC is trying to put these guys in a big spotlight, a big position. They're trying to have all the media behind Joe Pyfer, the interviews, the media day, the feeling of the main event. You're the man. Like Joe Pyfer was basically the man all week coming in to this fight because it was, the hype, be Joe Pyfer, all these different things. And I feel like it's one of those situations where looking back on it, the UFC's like, man, I feel like if we could have just given him Hermansson in a 3-round fight, we feel, maybe he could have gotten through him a little bit easier there. And then we give him that 5-round fight night main event after he's beaten a ranked guy, his confidence is high, and all those types of things, because the most important thing that the UFC has to do with these guys that are up-and-coming stars is what? They have to get them that ranking next to their name when the time is right, but they have to make sure they do everything they can to help that prospect get that ranking. Now, what do you mean by that, Jake? Well, I mean, they're going to try to give that guy every bit of advantage that they can to get these guys in positions. Don't believe me? Well, what do? They give Sean O'Malley, Petr Yan a 3-round fight. Now, if that's a 5-round fight, I feel like we all feel like we favor Petr Yan. Is that fair? Okay, so let's say that that's fair. Okay, well now we cut it down to a 3-round fight. We like our chances to where if the fight's razor close, there's a good shot that the prospect is still probably going to win because he's the prospect. He's got the hype behind him, all those different things, because that Yan and O'Malley fight was really close. But the point is, we're back to that scenario, guys, where I feel like the UFC, they've done a pretty good job of it with it in the past, but I really believe that they kind of fumbled this scenario with Joe Pyfer a little bit. Now, it's also on Pyfer because he needed to go out there and get the job done. The UFC, they can put you in every scenario, the best position possible, but it is your job to go out there and get it done. Can we all agree that the UFC did everything they could to screw Aljamain Sterling into the worst possible scenario when he fought Sean O'Malley? Did they not do that? Make him fight Henry Cejudo, turn around really quick, knowing that he has to cut a ton of weight to fight just a few months later against a fresh Sean O'Malley who's taken the time off, been sleeping, thinking about Aljamain Sterling the entire time pretty much, or Henry Cejudo, being prepared to go in there and fight these guys to take the belt and have every advantage possible, because that's exactly what the UFC will do. They will try to put you, if you are the star and the prospect that they won in that scenario, they are going to try to have all of the chips pushed on your side. They're going to try to give you every advantage that they can to make these things happen. So I want to hear what you all think down in the comments below. Do you agree that the UFC kind of fumbled this Pyfer situation? Because I know the UFC has done a pretty good job in the past of building stars, right? We've seen what they did with Conor McGregor. We've seen what they've done with Sean O'Malley. We saw what they've done with Ilia Topuria. So it's not all on the UFC here, right? I mean, because if Pyfer goes out and he wins last night, like, we're not even having this conversation. But it's something that I've noticed where it's like we see these guys kind of, they're ready to burst on the scene, and like Mike Malott, and he goes in there. Now, that was a 3-round fight, so that's kind of on Malott. But if maybe that's on a fight night where it's not in Canada and it's not all of those emotions that Malott has, where he's like, I'm on a pay-per-view, I'm in front of my hometown crowd, and all of that adrenaline, all of that energy is balled up to where you suffer a serious adrenaline dump. Now, I get it, like he's in his hometown. You know, you would think like, oh, well, those are advantages, but at the same time, those are also some disadvantages, right? There's a lot of distractions during fight week. Your friends are around, everyone, you know, you're kind of the big star. That's kind of distracting whenever you're a new guy on the scene. So it's like one of those things where, does that fight play out differently in a fight night where there's not a big crowd? Malott's not in his hometown. It's not a big spotlight for him. He's taking on Neil Magny. Like, we've seen these things happen. Now, like I said, it's a little harder to look into that because that was a 3-round fight, so fair play to the UFC. But I think looking back on this, the UFC is going to wish that maybe they made that a 3-round fight on some sort of pay-per-view. And then after that, for example, couldn't we all say that if Joe Pyfer goes out there, beats Jack Hermansson in a 3-round fight, then they give him Roman Dolidze next for a UFC Fight Night headliner, 5 rounds? Aren't we probably looking at it a little bit differently now that Joe Pyfer beat a ranked guy? He has the confidence coming into the matchup, his first 5-round fight. I don't know. What do you all think? Like this video, comment your thoughts below, subscribe to the channel, help your boy out. See you next time.